This next video is on testing and debugging. And we're particularly going to talk about two ways that's described in your book. The first one is going to be a stub, and the second will be a driver. All right, well, a stub is quite simple. A stub is basically a placeholder, right? It's a function that we haven't implemented yet. It's something that we plan to implement in the future, but we want to have a placeholder so that we can implement our other functions and depend on that function inside our implementation of other functions. What I mean is, let's look back at our guess what you were thinking program. In that program, we had a function called getRandom, right? And inside our getRandom function, we had a little, our algorithm that would allow us to get a range of to get a random number between a range of numbers, right? Between our low and our high, right? And inside that, we had to implement not too complicated function, but there was an algorithm that we had to implement to do that. But let's say we didn't want to implement that yet. Say that we wanted to work on something else, but we needed to get a random number in a different function. Well, in here, I could just say, okay, well, let me just have it return some number, right? I'm just going to return number 10, right? So at least I know that this function is going to return something, and then I can use this number to finish off my other program, right? So let's say I have another function, right? Inside my function, I want to loop x times, right? And whoever knows why. But this is what I need to do in my function. I want to say, all right, let me get a random number. So I'm going to say int n is equal to get random. And then I just do a loop, right? Now I can say for int I equals 0, while I is less than n, I plus plus. And then here I can do something else, right? So basically, my function is going to get a random number, and it's going to use that random number to determine how many times it's going to loop and do something else, right? So if I want to write this algorithm here, then I need to have this function definition. I need to have this function declared, but I don't necessarily need to have it defined. And so I use my stub to say, okay, I'm just going to return a number just so that you can test this function here. Then, once this function tests out well, then I can go ahead and implement my getRandom function, and it will actually return different numbers, and it will make my loop x times function work a lot better. I hope that was a good enough explanation. But basically, all a stub is a function that returns a placeholder value. Right, and that's pretty much all it is. So the next one is going to be a driver. Now, basically, a driver is a way for us to test a function multiple times, right? So we can check our boundaries of that function. So the way that works is that we will create a loop, right? We will create a loop, and it will ask you to enter a value, right? Get a value from a number. It will get a value from a user. And then it will use that value to test the output of a function. function, right? So what do I mean by that? Let's say that let's say I have my function double divide, right? And then I want to have my double dividend, and then also my double divisor. All right, so in order to really thoroughly test my function, even though this function is pretty simple, right, it would not be wise for us to just test one value and say, that value is what I expected, so my function works well, right? We don't want to do that. We want to be able to test a bunch of functions, right? And so rather going into our int main and doing something like this, right, we could go into our int main and we can say, all right, cout, divide, and then start putting in numbers 3 and 2, cout, divide, 5 and 2, right? And just doing a bunch of couts for different test cases that we want. Instead of doing that, we can actually create a function to loop over and do this for us, so we don't have to write all this code, and then we can keep testing out different values, right? So the way that we would do that is inside our main function. We would do something like just like we do our normal function, our normal programs that we've been writing. We'll have a variable to hold the user input, and this is basically to see if the user wants to continue looping. Then we want to have, a variable for our user input to test our function, right? Right, and so then we just do our loop. So do, and then we'll say something like cout, enter a value. And then we will have a value from our user. We'll store that to the input variable. Then we will say cout, and then we will actually pass that value to our function, right? So I'm gonna pass that to my function. So I'll just say divide. I guess in this case we actually will need 2 inputs. So I'm gonna say input 1, and then I'm gonna say input 2. Right, since we have a dividend and a divisor. And so I would just put in input 1 and input 2. Right, and so that will output the value, right? It will run those input 1, input 2 inside of the divide function, and then it will output whatever that divide function outputs. And then we can test to see if that's what we expected, right? And then at the end, it'll say something like cout, test again, right? And then the user has the ability to say yes or no. So we'll put that into our answer variable, and then we'll end our loop, and then we'll just say while the user answers yes, right? While the answer is equal to y, or answer is equal to y, right? And so this loop will keep going, and we can test different inputs, and this allows us to test our divide function multiple times without actually having to write a bunch of different test cases as we did here. So that is basically testing and debugging.